The UK housing market is a nightmare for first-time buyers. Average deposits of nearly 50,000, house prices 8 times average incomes, and for renters it's even worse, with rents remorselessly rising. But there's a new Labour government, and they've promised to build 1.5 million homes in the next 5 years. Now, assuming that they can achieve this goal, which I admit is a pretty big assumption, will it actually reduce prices? Is building houses and concreting the green belt the only way to solve the UK's housing crisis? Basic economics suggests that a rise in supply will lead to lower prices. Yet when it comes to the housing market, not everybody is convinced. The problem is that housing is different to a trade or commodity like coffee or oil. You can't short the housing market. In fact, the average time to sell a house in the UK is around 9 months. And more than any other good, house prices are also determined by things like interest rates, real wages, and mortgage availability. These are the 4 main factors influencing house prices, and it can be difficult to isolate one factor alone. Now we shall see how supply does influence prices, but not quite how we might expect. As a rough rule of thumb, different academic studies suggest that for every 1% increase in housing supply, house prices will be around 1 to 2% lower than otherwise. Now in 2022, there were 30 million dwellings in the UK. So if we increase supply by 1.5 million, this would raise housing supply by around 5%. So in theory, we would see house prices be around 7% lower than otherwise if we didn't build any at all. But that doesn't mean that house prices are therefore going to fall. To explain it, let's use this analysis by Litchfield, which shows the impact of building houses at the rate of 330,000 a year compared to current trends. In their analysis, prices would still rise, just at a slower rate. But the important thing is, there's no magic improvement in affordability from higher house building rates. Now this doesn't mean we shouldn't necessarily build houses, because there are many other long-term reasons to do so. And when people say that building houses won't cause prices to fall, they are likely to be right in one sense, but it's not the whole story. But if building 300,000 homes a year isn't going to solve housing affordability, what do we do? Do we have to build 500,000 homes a year? Well, there's a few factors to consider. Firstly, you don't necessarily have to just build houses to get more dwellings. Between 2007 and 2023, England built 2.9 million new homes, but the number of new dwellings increased by 3.3 million. That's an extra 406,000 new dwellings through things such as extensions and changes to the use of property. Now, converting local businesses into housing is not necessarily great for local communities. It's often a criticism of gentrification, but sometimes there can be quite innovative ways to find new houses, living on a canal boat, or even this converted skip, a symbolic protest against the broken London housing market. Secondly, when we look at housing markets, it's important not just to think about the national picture, but look at regional markets, because the most extreme house prices in the UK are located in the areas where it's proved most difficult to build more. If you compare these American cities, Austin, Texas has very few regulations. California, like London, do have a lot more restrictions, and you can see the big difference in the house price trajectory. This graph shows the relationship between rent increases and the increase in supply of properties. Generally, higher supply leads to lower rent increases. It's worth mentioning that the rented sector often reacts much more quickly to supply and demand than the buying sector. So we can see that supply has some effect on prices in the long term. But a much bigger effect, especially in the short term, is what is happening to real wages, interest rates and mortgage availability. If we take the mortgage market first, since a credit crunch, new stress tests have meant that buyers have to prove they can still afford a mortgage if interest rates go up. This rations demand more than pre-credit crisis. It's one reason why the recent rise in interest rates hasn't caused a flood of repossessions and properties coming onto the market like previous crashes. The big question is what's going to happen to interest rates, and the outlook for interest rates is somewhat mixed. Headline inflation has fallen dramatically since interest rates were put up to 5%. But the bad news is service sector inflation and wage inflation still remain something of a problem. The bank are reluctant to cut interest rates, especially with signs of some economic recovery. It means that affordability will remain stretched. As a share of income, mortgage repayments are quite high by historical standards, similar to when we had those crashes in 2008 and the early 90s. And this will probably have a bigger impact on limiting price increases than building more homes. Of course, when mortgages are expensive and it's difficult to buy, there's always a temptation for the government to do things like help to buy, artificially prop up demand. Will this Labour government do it? I think it's unlikely, but never rule anything out. But it's also important to remember that building houses isn't all about reducing prices. There are other reasons to build too. Firstly, a shortage of properties, especially in the southeast and the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, has been a constraint on the UK's pretty weak economic growth. Building more houses, especially rented property, would help increase labour market flexibility and help overcome some labour shortages. The UK also has a pretty bad vacancy rate, as low as 2%, compared to say 10% in the US. In the past few decades, the UK has been pretty bad at building homes, especially compared to our European neighbours. Centre for Cities projects that the UK has a deficit of around 4 million homes. This is based on the assumption of building at European rates. And this low supply of housing has more effects than just price. Firstly, it changes household formation. Young people living with their parents for longer. Secondly, a shortage of properties, especially rented accommodation, has led to record homelessness rates in the UK, one of the worst in the world now. And it raises an important question. If the UK does build more houses, how many of these will end up in the privately rented sector? Because due to rapid migration and growing population, there's been a sharp rise in demand for renting a growing number of households, and this is what's caused rents to rise. Now, this is probably the worst aspect of a housing crisis. More people renting face real affordability problems than those with mortgages. Also, when we say that building new houses will only limit price rises by, say, 1%, it may not sound very much at all, but over time it can become cumulatively more significant. Now, this conservative LSE study suggests that if we do build 300,000 homes a year, it will cut prices by 10% over 20 years. So it is of some value. It could make the difference between some people being able to buy and not. But having said all that, perhaps the bigger question to ask is, will the government be able to build 300,000 homes a year anyway? Is this all academic? Because their main hope is that by changing planning regulations to reduce the cost and making it easier to build, the private sector will be more motivated to build more houses. But there are a few problems. Firstly, they already have a lot of planning permissions where they haven't built on. Secondly, current rates of home building are in decline. It's a kind of a mini home building recession. Recently, one of the UK's biggest home builders, Barratt's, recently announced very disappointing plans to build less than expected new homes. Home builders are reluctant to massively increase supply if it means lower prices for them. Also, they've complained a lot about rising costs due to the recent inflation. It's more expensive to build, and a shortage of skilled labour will make it hard to massively increase the supply. To nearly double rates of home building is going to be quite a challenge, especially if the private sector just feel quite reluctant to do it. Now, the good news is there are other ways to address the housing crisis. The most direct way is to end cuts to housing benefit. This gives money directly to people who are struggling with housing costs. Of course, it's expensive, might require higher taxes, but it's much more direct than building homes. Secondly, the loss of social housing has done much damage, especially to the private rented sector. A lot of people have ended up here who shouldn't really be there and are struggling to pay market rents. But to overcome the past few decades of losing social housing, it's a gigantic task. But will the government get lucky? Will house prices fall on their own no matter what they do to supply? Will the market itself end the chronic overvaluation of prices and rents? This video looks at the likelihood of a fall in prices, irrespective of what happens to supply.